And today's guest, Debra Satz, is well known for her work in ethics, political philosophy, social philosophy. She's held many impressive titles at Stanford University, including being currently the Marta Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics and Society. She was until recently the director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, and she's now the Senior Associate Dean for the Humanities and Arts at Stanford University. And in addition to her appointments at Stanford, she has also held appointments at Harvard University, Princeton, and the University of Michigan. For those of you who aren't familiar with her work, it covers a range of exciting topics, including the ethical limits of the markets, the place of equality in a just society, feminist theory, democratic theory, education, international justice. I guess sort of almost everything that's interesting Professor Satz has worked on. Her work has appeared in our top journals, and among her many publications include this book, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, which you can find at all good bookstores now. And today she will be talking to us about the problems of privatization. So please join me in welcoming to Sonoma State, Debra Satz.
Thank you. Thanks to Josh for inviting me, and thank you for coming. Can everybody hear me? Okay. If at some point I am not audible, just signal and I'll up my volume, but I think I can do it in this room. Okay, so my topic is privatization, and by privatization I'm going to mean the contracting out of government services to private parties. Now, this is a phenomenon that has increasingly happened, although it's not a new phenomenon, but in the United States and in many European countries, publicly owned enterprises like electricity, transportation, and water have been contracted out to private companies. The governments of these countries, and especially the United States, has outsourced many of its core functions, including welfare provision, which is now increasingly provided for by the private sector, including nonprofit as well as for-profit organizations, the military, and I'll give you some statistics on that in a second, and prisons are increasingly in private hands. So here are just some examples for you to think about. So first, let's start with military commitments. A large percentage of the military used in Afghanistan and Iraq actually came from private contractors, not the government's official military. So a 2007 estimate had 180,000 private contractors supporting roughly 160,000 troops. So the private contractors actually outnumbered the number of official U.S. troops. Now think about prisons. About half of all immigrant detainees in the United States are held in private prisons. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, of the 1.6 million prisoners in the United States in 2008, almost 20% were housed in private facilities, and the trend line of privatization is going up. And final example is security. In the United States, and this is a figure from 2000, private security employed 1.5 million people against about 800,000 public police. So in other words, the number of private guards in the United States is almost twice the number of federal, state, and local police officers. All right, so that's just data. But what should we think about the privatization of these types of services? Let's see. What should we think about? All right, so let me start first by thinking about some kind of core principles we might use in deliberating about this. And I think one principle is it's really important to identify all the values that are at stake in a decision about whether to privatize or not. So one thing philosophy does, and maybe some of you study philosophy is really good at trying to make distinctions and point out there might be values involved that you might have overlooked. And that's what I'm going to try to do in this talk, is say there's a value that might be at stake in some privatization decisions that's often overlooked and not counted. Another thing in thinking about policy is only a better policy can defeat another policy. So it really matters what the options are, right? So when you're deciding whether to privatize or not to privatize, you want to think about what are the possibilities, and you want to compare. It's not a very good policy proposal to just defeat a policy without offering something in its place. So I think one thing we're going to want to do is think about what are the options that are on the table. So that's two general principles. Now let me say more specifically, in the case of privatization, I want to call attention to some of the values that are often seen as at stake in the decision. And I hope that will be my next slide. No, that's the two guiding principles there. And now, okay, so what are some arguments in favor of privatizing? Well, the obvious one and the most common one when people are making a decision about whether or not to remove something from the government and put it into the hands of private enterprise is efficiency. So one of the things we know about competition is that it's a very good mechanism for disciplining costs, right? If you have nobody competing against you, right, there's no motivation, right, to innovate or to try to save resources. But if I'm competing and I need to outperform my competitor to stay in business, that's a powerful incentive, right? And so we rely in lots of cases on competition, right, in order to generate efficiency. And why is efficiency important? Well, efficiency is important because you can generate more goods, right, more wealth, more things that you care about with lesser inputs. And so if you have a choice between, let's say, fighting a war, and you could generate less inputs for the same output, and the inputs depend on, for example, people who are putting their lives at risk, it's better to do that in a more efficient way than a less efficient way. You don't want to waste lives. So efficiency is a really powerful value, and it's always, behind the privatization decisions are always arguments about efficiency. Now that means that if efficiency is the value, it's an empirical question whether or not privatization improves efficiency. And just as an aside, if any of you are following the recent Labour Party leadership change in Britain, a radical has just come to the fore in the British Labour Party who's running on a program of renationalizing the railroads. And this program, this one plank of his program, is popular on the right and on the left because actually the denationalization of the railroad turned out to be very efficient. And we can talk about the reasons. But at any rate, that's an empirical claim, and it will matter what the facts are in thinking about efficiency. Okay, a second argument in favor of privatization is diversity. When you have one supplier of a good, let's say the government, there's a tendency for that supplier, right, to homogenize. First of all, you get actually some benefits from scale, right? So you provide one argument against, that you often hear against public education, is it's not good for experimentation, right? It tends to be conservative. There's a way that people go about doing things, and allowing many entrants into the market, instead of just having one supplier, allowing many suppliers allows for innovation and experimentation, right? And experimentation and innovation is a good. Now, that doesn't tell you exactly that you have to privatize. You could think of the United States running 50 experiments in each state, because each state has somewhat different laws governing things like education or taxation. So we could think of it as 50 experiments. But it is true that having multiple suppliers breaking things down is good for diversity. Third argument that's often given is freedom, right? I should be able to choose for myself the level of different goods that I want. If there's one supplier, there might be a uniform provision of that good, right? And so maybe, this is an argument you often hear in debates about healthcare, right? That people who are opposed to, let's say, a single payer system or a uniform system of healthcare provision will often say, but, I might want more healthcare than is offered by the government plan, and it's part of my liberty to be able to choose the level of healthcare I want for myself. And a fourth argument that I won't I'll just mention is that, a lot of people will say, look, privatization, as I said, it's not new, so why make a big deal about it? It's been going on for, we have private-public partnerships that go back, 100 years, so maybe there's no big issue here. Okay, so that's the positive arguments for privatization. What are the arguments against? Well, there are kind of four main arguments against. One is diminished accountability. So here's a nice way of thinking about that. It's actually it's much harder to track 100 agents who are doing things than one agent who's doing something, right? There's much more information costs to figure out who's doing what and when. Nobody's watching, right? There's no kind of overseeing agency. We're relying on competition. And so a lot of people think privatization diminishes accountability. It actually, and connected to diminishing accountability, is the worry that it end runs public deliberation. So here's a way you could think of it as end running, going around public deliberation. Supposing the public is really opposed to a war, right? So the public doesn't want to devote, right, resources to the war. But the government contracts out with private parties, as it did in Iraq and Afghanistan. That actually can give the government, sometimes people think privatization diminishes the power of government, but in this case, arguably it raised the power of government because the government was able to do something that the public might not have had any appetite for. And the diminished accountability is, while the federal government is under an injunction to publish the stats on soldiers who are killed, it wasn't under any injunction to publish the statistics on the Blackwater, what was then called Blackwater, employees who were killed. So the public didn't really have any way of knowing what was going on in Afghanistan in terms of deaths. It actually gave the government a way to end run public deliberation. So that's a worry about privatization. The government can sometimes expand its power by privatizing as opposed to diminish its power. Another worry about privatization is that it can lead to inequality. I said one virtue of privatization might be that it allows people to kind of opt in and opt out and get the levels of things like security or healthcare they want. But another thing is when you're relying on a market system, of course, you're introducing, by that very fact, some inequality. And when the government provides a good, at least arguably, it owes all its citizens equal benefit from the goods that it provides. But private companies don't owe that to citizens. They owe citizens the ability to purchase the good at the minimum cost that's possible. So inequality can be a worry in the privatization decision. And finally, some people worry that it undermines respect for government. Often people who push privatization are pushing privatization precisely because they want to, make a small government. And that was true in a lot of the debates about what's the proper size of government. A lot of people think government, we don't need government to do any of this. That's a fourth reason. Okay, so as I said, these arguments, the 4 plus arguments and the 4 minus arguments, depend on a bunch of things. They depend, first of all, on empirical facts, like Is it really the case that privatization is more efficient? Is it really the case that privatization introduces inequality? So there are some factual social scientists study these things and they try to figure out what's really going on with the privatization of a particular industry. But there are also some values that are clearly involved. So if you didn't care about inequality, then the fact that privatization might increase inequality wouldn't count as a negative for you. If you don't care about accountability, it's hard not to count about accountability because accountability is linked to efficiency. But if you didn't care about accountability that much, then again, this wouldn't be an important argument. If you don't care that much about efficiency, or you think efficiency is trumped by other values. So there's a value part and there's an empirical part of thinking about the privatization decision. So what I want to do is raise another value that's often not looked at in the debates about privatization, and it's what I'm going to call corruption. Now, corruption could be an accountability value, right? You could just be worried like they're bad actors, but I want to make an argument not about private corruption, which would be covered by accountability. I want to make an argument that there are forms of corruption that don't show up on these lists and that we ought to pay attention to them. And in particular, I'm going to be concerned about two kinds of corruption. A corruption of the kind of good that you're supplying is one, and a corruption of the institutions themselves. And I'm going to take those two and try to apply them to the cases I started with of prisons, punishment, prisons, the military, and security. Okay, so two kinds of corruption. So let me try to put these on the table. And let's see. No, that was too bad. There. Three concepts of corruption. Okay, so individual corruption I'm going to spend the least amount of time on. That's the most common one. That's just the idea of the pursuit of private gain, right? Infiltrating public purposes, right? So bribery, giving, sexual favors, nepotism, very familiar. You can find it in, there's corruption in government as well as out of government and private industry. But you might worry, if you worried about accountability, you might worry that individual corruption could be harder to track in cases where you have multiple and complicated supply chains than when you have a single actor, namely the government, operating under a uniform system of rules. So I'm not going to spend any time on that because I think individual corruption is covered by accountability. So I want to turn to a second kind of corruption. It's actually one in my own work I've been very skeptical about, but in this particular context, I'm going to be less skeptical, and that's intrinsic corruption. So that's the idea that how you supply a good isn't totally neutral to the meaning of that good or the nature of that good. So I'll give you an example from Michael Sandel, who wrote about friendship. So here are two ways of getting friends. You could get them by being kind and nice and interesting and funny, or you could get them by buying them. So here's what Michael Sandel writes. Suppose you want more friends than you have. Would you try to buy some? That's not likely. A moment's reflection would lead you to realize that it couldn't work. A hired friend is not the same as a real one. You could hire people to do some of the things that friends typically do, pick up your mail when you're out of town, look after your children in a pinch, or in the case of a therapist, listen to your woes and offer sympathetic advice. Until recently, you could even bolster your online popularity by hiring some good-looking friends for your Facebook page for 99 cents per friend per month. Although all these services can be bought, you can't actually buy a friend. Somehow, the money that buys the friendship dissolves it, turns it into something else. And I think Sandel is right about friendship. I actually think somebody who thought they could buy a friend doesn't understand what it means to have a friend, right? You could buy something, you could buy a friend kind of look-alike, but you can't actually buy a friend because friendship is based on bonds between people, right, that don't have anything to do with an explicit quid pro quo, particularly an explicit market quid pro quo. So think about this now with respect to government goods, and you could see that some government goods are going to be like friendship. So what's an obvious case? Take the decisions of a judge, okay? I mean, you could buy the decisions of a judge. Maybe, arguably, we do that to some extent now because it's not easy for poor people to get a lawyer. But we don't actually pay the judge to issue a certain decision. We could do that, but if we did that, whatever the judge would give us as a exchange wouldn't be justice, right? It would be something else. And justice, in the form of judicial opinions, right, depends on it not being bought. So if you try to buy and sell it, you change it into something else. And I'm going to leave it to you to think about whether some forms of punishment are like that, right? So here's a way of thinking of punishment as like that. There's a big difference between whether the state puts me in prison, right? I get locked up because I do something, and whether Josh puts me in prison. I mean, Josh could have every justification for, kind of putting me in a room and closing the door. Maybe I was obnoxious. But whatever he does, it isn't going to be the same thing, right, as the punishment that's executed by the state. In order for punishment to take a certain form, people have to stand in a relationship to the state in an appropriate way. Somebody acting on behalf of the state might be morally justified in doing things to somebody, but it's not the same thing as the state doing it. And that will get us into the worrying about some cases of private punishment when we think about private prisons, whether or not the fact that a prison is privately run and that the kind of punishment administered in the prison is done so by a private company changes in some way the nature of what's being supplied. So I'm going to leave that for you to think about. I think justice, buying judicial opinions, the intrinsic corruption argument really works. Punishment, maybe not. Maybe not, because maybe we think it's one thing to issue the punishment, like what the punishment should be, and it's another thing who executes that. And maybe private parties have the right to execute state decisions. And that brings me to my third kind of corruption, and this is the one I want to focus on, which is what I'm going to call institutional corruption. And that's the idea that the purposes of an institution, whether the institution is defense or punishment or security, can be undermined over time by the privatization decision in some contexts. So what's important about what I'm calling institutional corruption is it's not individual corruption. You don't need quid pro quo, so nobody's being paid off in the case I'm going to talk about, and nor do you have intrinsic corruption where a valued good is changed into something else, like a friend becomes something else or a judicial decision becomes something else by the fact that it's subjected to the market and to competition. Instead, so here's an example of institutional, what I mean, because I realize this is a little abstract, so let's see if this example helps. Okay, so think about campaign contributions. So you could imagine a single case of campaign contribution being corrupt. Let's say you're trying to bribe somebody. But you could also imagine many cases where campaign contributions are harmless. You're probably all too young. Has anybody ever contributed to a campaign? All right, so there's an age. All right, I contribute to campaigns all the time. I'm not trying to bribe anybody. I think of it as, kind of harmless. I'm trying to generate support for some candidate or cause I care about. Doesn't seem to be a problem. So there's no individual corruption, no quid pro quo, no intrinsic corruption. I'm not changing the nature of a good. But you could worry that if campaign contributions become really big, right, and really make the politician depend on them in a particular way, politicians aren't particularly dependent on my campaign contribution, it could corrupt the system of representation, right? So it would be an institutional worry that having a campaign system where very, very large amounts of money are important in the running of the campaign and are of a size and frequency that make the candidates dependent on them, that could undermine the point of the independence or autonomy we want in a representative decision. So I'm going to argue, in the few minutes I have, that idea of institutional corruption has a place in our thinking about the cases that I just mentioned. So I'm going to skip ahead and turn to institutional corruption. Really skip ahead. Skip 15 pages. All right. Okay. So let's think about private prisons. Okay. So how might the privatization of prisons raise a concern about institutional corruption? So here's actually a real example. Well, I'll get to the real example in a second. So let's say, as a society, we have a criminal justice system and a punishment system, but we have a strong incentive as a society to minimize, right, reduce the amount of crime. We don't want there to be a lot of criminals. We think it's a dead loss waste to society when we have to lock people up. Sometimes we do have to lock people up, but our goal is not to lock people up for any reason. It's to do the best we can, short of locking them up, and then lock them up if we have to. However, privatization of prisons introduces a new kind of motive into the idea of punishment. So I'm going to give you two recent examples. So the private prison industry, and there's something called the Corrections Corporation of America, which is a very large conglomeration of private prisons, was secretly involved in drafting Arizona's harsh anti-immigrant law, a law that, by the way, would boost the amount of immigrant detention centers. So whatever you think about detention centers, and maybe you think we should have them, or maybe you think we shouldn't, it's clear, though, that you don't want them for the sake of making money. You want them because you think there's some social purpose and it would be unfortunate that we have to do this, and so forth. Here's another second example. So prisons are expensive to run, and it's obvious why the government wants to privatize them. They're really expensive to run, and if you can privatize them, you get them off your budget, right? So really strong interest in transferring the costs of this to another party. So, which is part of why privatization of prisons is growing. So recently, last year, the Corrections Corporation of America offered to relieve 48 states of their fiscal crises by buying their prisons. So that's a big cost saving for a lot of states that are very scrapped. Maybe they could give more money to the CSU system if they didn't have to give so much money to the prisons, so this looks like a good thing. But they had one condition, that the states would agree to keep the prisons 90% full for the next 20 years. Okay, now, you can see why they need that, right, to make the prisons profitable. But if the purpose of the institution of punishment is to, for us, it's a last resort, it's a failure, we don't want to see a lot of people in prison, we hope not to see it, then you can see how the privatization of prisons begins to corrupt the purposes of the institution over time. And that, I think, is a distinctive kind of worry. It's not a worry about efficiency. You can get a really, you can be really efficient with the 90% of the people you have in prison by, cost cutting in various ways and by, getting, one supplier of food so that there's economies of scale. Okay, so that's a worry about, everybody follow this? Anybody not? Yeah, all right, good. So let me give you I'll try to do this with the other examples. So let's think about private security. So security companies can only survive if there's a demand for their services. One way you can ensure demand is to influence or change the consumer's perceptions of threats by engaging in deliberate efforts to increase fear, anxiety, and insecurity, right? You can manipulate it so people feel really scared. I get, phone calls and I see ads all the time about, why I should buy better security system. And it makes perfect sense. I'm not faulting the company for having that as its goal. That is an appropriate goal for a private company to have. On the other hand, if we had a system that relied solely on private provision of security, you could worry about the manipulation, right, of people's preferences, because what our interest is in as a society is having the optimal level of security, right? We don't need big surpluses of security. We need the amount of security that's appropriate given the circumstances we're in, but the private provision of security might corrupt that goal of providing the optimal level of protection because the company has an interest in making you feel more insecure, so you'll buy more. Okay, and my final example, how am I doing? I'm good. 7 minutes. All right, look at that. All right. So my final example was the privatization of the military, and I've already said a little bit about that, which is that privatization of a military might, again, corrupt another important thing we have about military protection in a democracy, which is that the use of force ought to be agreed to by the people. And one of the ways that the people do that is through control over the government. If the government wants to wage an unpopular war and you're opposed to it, you vote against the government. You can vote against provisions to funding the unpopular war, as people have done in various wars that they objected to. If you privatize the provision of military services and transfer to some extent both the funding and the risk to private parties, you run the worry, or you raise the worry about the institution of military defense in a democracy corrupting and moving in a different direction. Now, some people have argued that if we didn't have private contractors, we would have to do one of two things. We would either have to make the tours of duty for our current soldiers even longer than they are, which would not be popular and probably not be very efficient, or we would have to institute a draft. And obviously instituting a draft would then give the public, right, more control over the process. Drafts tend to be unpopular, except in times where people think there's a justification for the war. So in these cases, privatization actually leads to less accountability and potentially a warping of the regulatory framework and the purposes for which we engage in exercises of force abroad. There are other worries about the reliance on private parties. Just I'll raise as an aside, Machiavelli worried a long time ago, that mercenaries also had their motives corrupted, that they didn't fight for the right reasons. And in particular, he worried that because they were just interested in the pay, they wouldn't fight that hard and they would run away and they wouldn't be as good soldiers. So this is an empirical claim he made, that mercenaries didn't fight as hard. I don't know what the data on that actually is, but I'll just note it. Okay, let me here's another example outside my, and that's education. So education is a nice example for thinking about privatization because there's been a lot in the news about private companies engaging in education and what we should think about that. Now, obviously, again, a lot depends on how this works. One of the arguments in favor of privatization of education has been efficiency. Right, that education is a pretty inefficient, having me lecture here to you, pretty inefficient, like it'd be much better either to get I'm not being paid that much, but to get an adjunct here, who would, isn't paid such a high salary, or even better to do it online where you would just see an image and that would be sufficient. And the image could be shown to, tens of thousands of people. There's a question about what happens when you move to a privatization system in education, and I'll just give you one data point, and we can talk about this more. There was a U.S. committee looking into private educational institutions, for-profit institutions, and found that only 15% of the revenue generated in private education was spent on teaching, while everything else was spent, I think 40% was spent on marketing. So you have an institution now where more is being spent on marketing than on teaching, and you could worry, again, that there's a corruption of the purposes of educational institutions, which are not to market, but really to teach students. Okay, so to conclude, why is any of this important? Well, I think in some of the debates about privatization, people overlook the institutional purposes of the institution that the government has in place, why we have it, what's the point of having security, what's the point of having a military, what's the point of having prisons. They overlook those purposes. And so whether or not privatization affects those purposes isn't part of the debate. The debate tends to be mostly about efficiency. And I think efficiency is very important. I take the point that efficiency is a really important variable, and sometimes privatization is to be preferred because it increases efficiency and it doesn't sacrifice any other values we care about. But sometimes it does sacrifice other values we care about, and I'm arguing that one value we care about is about the purposes that we have institutions for, and that we should be really worried in these cases of punishment and military service and security about completely privatizing our forms of provision. And I will stop on that and take questions. Thank you. So questions? Yeah.
So did you happen to watch the Republican debate?
I heard some of it, but I didn't hear the whole thing.
Donald Trump made a very interesting, funny point that he said in his debate the reason why I was able to get so much done as a businessman, as an economist over the past few years is I gave money to the person who was going to win the election. Is that sort of an example of this whole privatization that you're talking about?
Well, that might be an example of institutional corruption. I mean, so some people have argued, Larry Lessig, for anybody who knows Larry Lessig's work as a law professor at Harvard, has done a lot on looking at campaign finance in the United States and has made the argument that the kind of system we have is corrupt because, in effect, because of the dependence on politicians, on needing a very high amount of money, and the main way to get that money is from private parties, makes those people very dependent on those private parties. And there's a lot of literature that shows that representatives tend disproportionately to favor the interests of their more wealthy constituents. Now, as I said, a policy can only be defeated by a better policy. I took that as one of my conditions. And one question, which is an empirical question in part, is, are there better design systems? And of course, some people argue that attempts at campaign finance either don't work because money finds its way around, or they compromise other values that we should care about. So the people who make the argument that money is fungible with speech. But certainly the Trump line, that line, would be, in Lessig's view, and I would argue, an example of an institutional corruption. Yeah, there.
You've mentioned something about the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex. Wouldn't you agree that there's a question of morality in regards to how they carry out their actions? For example, I know Blackwater, they massacred a huge amount of Iraqi citizens during the Iraq War. So wouldn't you agree that there's a question of morality when it comes to how they perform the actions and how they do it? Right.
So that's an empirical question. So, you know, you might worry, and people have worried, that turning things over to private parties that aren't socialized in the same way, let's say that in the U.S. military, the socialization and the norms that are, trickle down to the everyday soldiers are very different. Machiavelli worried the opposite, though. So actually what's interesting about the Machiavelli argument, just as a point of history, is Machiavelli, it used to be that mercenaries were Swiss primarily, and they would run away when the going got really tough, and there was some evidence that they engaged less in massacres than ordinary soldiers who were fighting for a cause and then were willing to massacre for the cause, and the people who were just doing it for money. I'm not going to massacre. I'm just going to do the minimum and get out of here alive. So that I agree with you that matters to the privatization decision, obviously, right? If one privatization of the military leads to more deaths, more civilian deaths, more harm, that would be a powerful argument against it. That's, I think, as I said, an empirical claim. And in the Blackwater case, people have argued that because the ties between the Blackwater soldiers and the U.S. Military norms was so loosened, right, that they didn't feel accountable to behave as soldiers feel accountable to behave, because if they don't behave that way, they're subject to very strict punishments. So, yeah.
So you were saying that a lot of states are favorable for privatizing their prisons, so we don't have to pay for it. It's expensive. So how do they make money, and who pays for that?
So it's not true that it doesn't cost them to privatize at all. They pay the private companies to run the prisons for them, but they might pay less than they would have to pay if they were sort of private companies are in competition. One of them, says, well, we'll do it for this amount, and so they take that because it's not that expensive. And then the private company can actually, by being more efficient, cut costs. Or if it can't be more efficient in the way of cutting costs by, let's say, cutting on food or cutting on for example, you don't have to employ unionized workers if you're a private company.
So the
So-
quality in the prison would probably go down.
The quality might go down, again, empirical question, right? So it could go down, but one thing that's clear though is the private company has a different interest than the state does. You know, the state, and again, cuts both ways. Efficiency has some good things to say about it, right, in its favor, but in the case of locking people up, we certainly don't only care about efficiency. We care about a lot of other things. And one thing we don't want to do is generate a lot of people in prison just for the sake of driving down the per prisoner costs, right? But the private company has an interest in doing that, and that's, I think, a case of institutional corruption. Yeah.
The state university system was founded on the notion that higher education is a public good, and you brought up the for-profit universities, privatizing that. Can you explain the difference between a for-profit university and a place like Stanford or Harvard that's also private education? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so Stanford and other other private institutions are part of the nonprofit sector. So they're under a whole different set of rules. There are no shareholders we're responsible to, right? We don't have to show at the end of the day, you know, on the books that here's how much we generated. We don't pay off shareholders. Our money, which of course is quite considerable, is under various kinds of restrictions on how we can spend it. Because we get tax deductions for being a nonprofit, we have to spend the money in certain ways. We're now under various kinds of conditions about how much we have to spend. So it's a very different, and actually Stanford is an interesting case because we lose money. Stanford loses money on each student that it admits. We don't gain money. We're not a tuition-driven institution. So, you know, most students net, I think the average cost of educating a Stanford student, believe it or not, is $100,000 per student, and the tuition is about $50,000, and about 60 to 70% pay much less than that, and anybody who makes family makes under $125,000 goes for free. So that's not, you know, and that's not a profit calculation. Nobody has to justify to shareholders that we're charging this rate because we can then pay you these dividends. So there's a whole, I mean, there are interesting questions though about the nonprofit sector because some privatization involves the nonprofit sector. So charities, a lot of charity work in the United States is conducted by the religious community, which is nonprofit. There is a question about whether or not in some way you're corrupting the institution even when you turn certain kinds of tasks over to nonprofits. Maybe the nonprofits have different motives and different aims than the state would have. For example, you might have aims in getting people to endorse the faith tradition that you're part of, and you put people in different kinds of relationships. So there's still a question about you can raise the corruption question about the nonprofit sector. It's a good question.
So I think we actually have to stop there.
Okay, I'm happy to take more questions if people want to come by.
Thank you.